through our Genesis study. We're on week 7. Next week will be our last week. We're looking at basically the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And we have used the seas idea, creation, corruption, catastrophe, confusion, as kind of the basis for how we move through Genesis 1 through 11. And so we move to a new sea tonight. We move to catastrophe. I'm sorry to not have handouts for you tonight, but I just ran out of time. I will point out just a couple of things for you if you're interested. I've been able to post a few of what we've done online. I've created a YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube Creation Connection Ministries, you'll be able to go back and see that if you're of mind to do that. And also, if you want the PowerPoint presentations that I've been doing, I'm going to upload them to Dropbox. I believe I've got a few of them already there. And so if you'll just give me your email address, I'll send you an invite and you can set up your own Dropbox account and have access to them as well. So as we move through tonight, and God said, and look at the catastrophe, it's for me, when I go traveling or just spend any time outside, I look at the landscape and I'm always filtering it through this. How did the flood change that? How did the flood get that there? That's just automatically how I process it. So hopefully by the end of class, you'll be right there with me and you won't be able to travel outside or down any highway ever again without looking at layers again differently. Because even when you go through the cutouts on the interstates, I see layers. And to me, those layers are part of the Genesis flood. They're there because of that. And so that's what we're going to work through. Now, to start here with this idea of looking into the ocean floor. If you go back and look at the idea of sonar technology when it was first developed in the early 1900s, it was a process by which a wave could be sent out and measure the response that it got back. World Wars I and II certainly were part of the developing and putting a practical application in place for sonar technology. And over the next couple of decades, they began to use sonar technology to begin to map the ocean floors. Ultimately, the time and money it would take to map the entire ocean floors through this process was not feasible, but they used a satellite, and they've been able to come up with a pretty solid, here's just an idea of what that looks like, but a pretty solid idea of some of what the ocean floors look like today. Now, some of the key features you'll see is the ocean shelf and ridges and some of the bases where the volcanoes come through. And this is some of the things they're able to capture. But there's one particular thing that caught my attention was something called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. It is a plate boundary, and this particular spot is in the Atlantic, and it serves as a marker between two ocean floor plates. And they say it's a divergent plate in that it is where the sediment has been moved apart. Now, with respect to plate tectonics, some scientists, geologists, believe that the crust, the Earth's crust, like the North American continental plate, is moving at a very slow rate. I'm not quite convinced that that's occurring. But ultimately, I'm going to make the case tonight that whether they are still moving or not, that ultimately they're in their current positions because the flood pushed them apart from one another. Back when we originally had what was a unified continent. And so if you'll see here, the red moving down the middle, that is where the North Atlantic Ridge is located. And if you look at the leading edge of South America on the east, look at the leading edge of Africa on its west, look at the curved edge of the United States on its east, and if you begin to put them together like a puzzle piece, they seem to fit very neatly together. Today, most creationists, as well as secular geologists, recognize that all the land masses were once one solid mass of land called Pangaea. Now, the man that first kind of put this thought in front of us was this man, Antonio Snider Pellegrini. That doesn't sound exactly like a geologist's name, but you step back into the 1800s, and he was the first published a book called The Creation and Its Mysteries Unveiled. The book was published in 1858. And his basis for looking at this book is he recognized that the continents were all once connected, and then he used the Bible's description, as we see in Genesis chapter 1, that on day 3 talks about one land mass. And then we look at the Genesis flood, and he believed that the Genesis flood broke the continents apart. Now, the problem that Antonio ran into, if you'll catch the date that his book came out, if you remember some of our previous conversations, 1858 is when his book came out. The very next year, Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, came out in 1859. Now you say, well, that's biology and this is geology. Well, remember what we talked about is that some of Darwin's ideas, or at least what gave him encouragement in moving forward, was based upon a man named Charles Lyell's books, who came out in the 1830s, called The Principles of Geology. And Lyell began to stretch the time frame of history, and so where there had been an already established biblical chronology of about 6,000 years, Lyell began to stretch it out. And what we see at that time period is we're coming out of the Age of Enlightenment, where the ideas of the biblical history are being diminished more and more. And so Antonio ran into the problem is that his theory, although sound, was based in Scripture and was ultimately discarded. And it wasn't until the early part of the 1900s, until some secular geologists began to circle back around and recognize what he had already been saying all along, and then the theory took off, or the idea took off, and took traction and moved forward. But at this time period, he was pretty much dismissed because he used the Bible as his basis. Now, this is a little bit cleaner map right here, but you'll see the very dark line right down the middle. This is in general how the ocean floor looks today. Now, they still can't get super detailed. The ocean is extremely deep. I mean, it's just impossible to get that kind of technology down there. But this is a pretty good idea, and if in fact that this North Atlantic ridge will function as a place in which the Genesis flood came through, then you can certainly see where the Genesis flood cracked through in various other places, and I'll flesh this out in a few minutes. But the point again is we have, I believe, some very tangible evidence of an event described in Genesis that the flood actually did exist and did impact the entire face of the earth, and of such a nature that it was able to move continental plates apart from one another. The reason I struggle with plate tectonics moving a quarter of an inch a year is what mechanism is strong enough to even move plates? I mean, it's almost like trying to lay underneath a folding table and you just blow on it underneath. I mean, what forces do you need to move a plate? We're not talking about something little. You need something powerful, and I think the Genesis flood is the sufficient mechanism for that. Now, if you turn in your Bibles to Genesis 7, we're going to read.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Also in Revelation, Christ talked about shaking the earth again in the future to a point that it's never been known before. So it's hard to tell what kind of cataclysmic earthquake or whatever that's going to cause, because we saw what it did the first time.
I think I think the best idea we might have of that is we're going to look at the end at 2 Peter 3 when it talks about the fiery judgment, the earth will be destroyed by fire.
Sure.
And that will be the end of this earth as we know it. So good point, Mike. Would somebody read, picking up with verse 11 and go all the way through the end of that chapter for me?
In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened, and rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. On the very same day, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, Japheth, Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons with them entered the ark. They and every beast according to its kind, and all the livestock according to their kinds, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth according to its kind, and every bird according to its kind, every winged creature. They went into the ark with Noah, 2 and 2 of all flesh, in which there was the breath of life. And those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him. And the Lord shut him in. The flood continued 40 days on the earth. The waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth. And the ark floated on the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. And all the flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals, creeping things, and birds of the heavens. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days.
Thank you. I've already been making the case that what we see on the face of the earth has been shaped by the Genesis flood. But upon what basis? Because really, so much of what I'm talking about is really, I'm just trying to build a model based on what I see in evidence in the world today. But it's really trying to be based on this first verse here that we're reading tonight, Genesis 7:11. What does the fountains of the great deep, what does that mean? Because if you're like me, you were raised in an environment with giraffes' necks sticking out of the top of the ark, Noah on the front with his little stick just being happy, and a gentle rain falling for 40 days and 40 nights. And that was the limit of your idea of what it took for the world to be covered by rain. And what I have found as I continue to study and grow in this is what occurred at the Genesis flood was so much more dynamic and so much more impactful that even as I study and see it, I still have a hard time grasping its intensity, its breadth, its power. It's difficult really to grasp because I don't really have a point of reference. So what we're going to do is walk through this particular verse 11 and just unfold this for just a minute. Now the term fountains is taken from the Hebrew word mayan, which means a spring or an opening. Simple enough. The great deep, taken from tehom, which means depths, deep place, or abyss. Now, this is a similar or the same word as we see in Genesis chapter 1, when darkness was upon the surface of the deep, and we see the Spirit of God hovering over this. Now, what do we see in Genesis chapter 1 on day 1? Is I made the case that that was just simply earth was a body of water, because we don't see dry land being created until day 3. And so this great deep also should be seen as subterranean forces moving to the surface through a created opening. There's something going on down deep in the earth's crust that is changing, that is being triggered, I believe, by God. And the word broken up, bakwa, is to split or to cleave. And so if I could give you Tommy's translation of this part, I'm not working on a new translation of the Bible here. This is just my little thing here. is from deep inside the earth, great amounts of water and magma broke through the earth's crust, creating a fountain that shot miles into the sky. Now, the picture that I want to begin to get you to see here is we have under the earth a combination of water, pockets of water, magma, that is in pre-flood, is in a very solid and consistent state. What I mean by it's stable. Now, we can only look to God for what triggered this change. What went from stable to unstable? What triggered it? It's got to be His hand. But there were processes that began to work under the earth's surface that eventually returned and broke through the crust and began pushing plates apart. And some would see that this breaking through, this hot material, when it hit the ocean water, would have heated it and created a column of steam that would have reached miles into the sky. And that some people believe that a lot of the rain that fell to the earth actually was the water that was on the earth or under the earth. And so as the water comes up into the sky, it begins to cool and returns back to the earth in the form of rain. Now, this isn't just a little fountain in that, oh, look at my fountain in the corner. I'm talking about a crack in the earth's surface from Greenland to the tip of South America, thousands of miles, one entire crack breaking through, and that's just probably one of a handful of such events across the face of the planet. You're talking columns of steam shooting miles up. Now we know with recent tidal waves or tsunamis that have hit specifically in Japan that it takes very little shift in the Earth's crust to create a tsunami. What we're talking about here is a significant shift in the Earth's crust on multiple locations over thousands of miles. We're talking water and sediment being thrown into chaos. Am I describing it? Are you beginning to grasp what we're talking about with the intensity of what's going on here? The entire surface of the planet is being reshaped in this one event. The pre-flood world was gone. Now, one of the other things in the case I'm going to make is not only do we have this column of steam, but I believe this is where the volcanoes begin to erupt, is at this moment. That the Genesis flood, part of this fountains of the deep, are volcanic activity. And what you see here, this is called from South America all the way up across North America and along the eastern edge of Asia is called the Ring of Fire. All those red triangles there, or red spots, are volcanoes. Now there could be also some what's called subduction, but basically you've got volcanoes coming up right here. And again, at the start of the Genesis flood, these things begin to come to the earth, come to the earth's surface. And what we're going to see later is an ash cloud that is left in their wake. You know, when we think about, like with Yellowstone, which would be right in that region up there, that erupted, I'll say several thousand years ago. Because Yellowstone National Park is essentially a dormant volcano. Its ash cloud covered about a third of the United States. Now can you imagine hundreds of volcanoes going off all across the earth? In addition to all the water activity that's moving through.